China makes big promises, massive and unsustainable projects are commissioned. In the end, the host country is left with a giant debt.
A $5.5 billion highway, rising over 16,000 feet above sea level, is quietly slicing through the Himalayas. China's Trans-Himalayan Highway is not just a road, it's a statement. On the surface, it promises connection, but beneath the asphalt lies something far bigger. Beijing is using concrete and steel to redraw the map of Asia and shift the balance of global power. While the world's eyes are turned elsewhere, this highway is forging a new alliance and putting US strategy on the line. What's really at stake is much more than traffic. Building the impossible. The birth of the Trans-Himalayan Highway began not with fanfare, but with a series of quietly signed agreements and hushed meetings in smoky rooms, thousands of meters above sea level. China's leadership had learned long ago that the world often paid more attention to what was said than what was built. So, as headlines swirled about trade, tech, and the South China Sea, the real drama unfolded in the clouds. Engineers, planners, and laborers descended on Tibet, bringing with them not just machinery, but a sense of purpose that would be tested against every force nature could muster. The first challenge was the altitude. Nothing prepares the human body for the relentless thinness of Himalayan air. At over 16,000 feet, even the fittest worker feels winded climbing a single flight of stairs. Construction teams arrived in waves, each rotation forced to undergo rigorous high-altitude training. Medical tents dotted the camps, staffed around the clock by doctors armed with oxygen tanks and IV fluids. Altitude sickness was more than an inconvenience. It was a threat that could kill within hours if ignored. Yet the workers pressed on, driven by promises of high pay, national pride, and the understanding that failure was not an option. The machines suffered as much as the men. Excavators, cranes, and trucks that could carve canyons in the lowlands sputtered and stalled in the thin air. Engines overheated, oil thickened, batteries drained with shocking speed. Engineers rewrote entire manuals, designing custom parts and maintenance schedules to keep the operation moving. The tunnel-boring machines, massive steel monsters as long as football fields, faced rock so dense and cold it could shatter teeth or warp their tracks. Every meter gained was a victory, every setback a reminder that here, technology bowed to the mountain. Then came the weather. In the Himalayas, nature changes moods in moments. One morning, the sky would be clear, blue and infinite. By noon, clouds rushed in like cavalry, bringing snow, sleet, and hail. Temperatures plunged 40 degrees in a single afternoon. Roads became rivers of mud, then sheets of ice, then torrents of rock and water when the thaw came. The wind, sharp as a blade, never truly stopped. Stories spread through the camps of workers lost to sudden avalanches, of equipment swallowed overnight by landslides, of tunnels that collapsed before dawn could reveal the damage. Geology offered no mercy either. The Himalayas are not ancient, settled mountains. They are young, angry, and still rising, their very bones grinding as the Indian and Eurasian plates collide. This collision spawns frequent earthquakes, some so small they are measured only by sensors, others violent enough to flatten villages and shatter roads. The memory of Nepal's devastating 2015 quake haunted every team, reminding them that no amount of concrete or steel could guarantee survival. Designers consulted with seismologists, geologists, and disaster experts from across the globe, trying to anticipate the unpredictable. Foundations were drilled deep into stable rock where possible, tunnels reinforced with new alloys and shock-absorbing structures, bridges built on flexible supports designed to sway, not snap, when the ground moved. But perhaps the most dramatic feat was the 10-kilometer Gong Tunnel, aimed straight through the peaks near Everest itself. Drilling here was like surgery on a living giant. Progress slowed to a crawl, sometimes just a few meters per day. Workers spoke in hushed voices about the mountain's moods, about strange noises in the rock, about the feeling that they were trespassing on sacred ground. Local legends whispered that the peaks would not give up their secrets easily, Yet, day after day, the machines pressed forward, steel teeth gnawing through granite and ice, carving a passage for the world's highest traffic. Above ground, the bridges posed their own nightmares. Some valleys were too wide for standard construction. Teams developed new floating roadways, massive platforms resting on pillars that could flex and adjust as the land shifted below. These elevated sections allowed snow and rock to pass beneath without destroying the road. Climate-controlled way stations offered more than rest. They were lifelines, stocked with oxygen, food, and medical supplies for any emergency. Every station was also a communication hub, linking the highway with disaster response teams in Lhasa and Kathmandu, ready for the inevitable day when something would go wrong. Logistics became a game of chess. Supplies could only move in and out during short weather windows. Helicopters shuttled critical parts and injured workers when trucks were cut off. Local villages, at first wary of the endless noise and dust, began to adapt, selling food and supplies, and even offering shelter during storms. For many, the arrival of the highway meant the first real wages, the first electricity, the first real chance for children to see beyond their own horizon. Yet others worried about what would be lost: the silence, the safety, the traditions that kept them alive in one of the harshest places on Earth. As months turned into years, the rhythm of work became relentless. Successes were celebrated with fireworks and feasts. Failures mourned quietly and then buried, lest they slow the march of progress. Satellite images began to show the new road snaking its way south, cutting through clouds and across glaciers, bringing together worlds that had been divided by mountains for millennia. The government released videos of heroic workers, smiling through frostbite and exhaustion, claiming victory over the impossible. But beneath the surface, the purpose of the highway was always more than just transport. The planners in Beijing understood that infrastructure is power. Every new bridge was a lifeline for Tibet's struggling economy, a lever for controlling Nepal's politics, a message to India and the world that China's ambitions had no altitude limit. The road was built to carry trucks, but also troops, to bring medicine and grain, but also ideas and influence. The stakes were as high as the peaks themselves. As the final tunnels neared completion and the last stretches of tarmac glistened in the Himalayan sun, a new sense of urgency gripped every player watching from afar. This was not just a victory for engineers, but for strategists and dreamers who understood
during our construction, we could only try our best to reduce the possibility and damage.
That in the 21st century, roads are the new front lines. With every kilometer finished, Beijing's vision came into sharper focus, a vision that reached far beyond the summits. If a single highway could conquer the roof of the world, what could stop the ambitions of the nation that built it? And as the last boulders fell away, everyone from Lhasa to Washington knew the world was not the same as before. The chessboard in the clouds. Long before the first stone was set, the Himalayas were more than just a wall of rock and ice. They were a living boundary, a silent barrier shaping history, power, and the destinies of nations. For centuries, these mountains divided two ancient civilizations, China and India. Trade flowed only in whispers, armies rarely crossed, and politics was shaped as much by what was impossible as by what was real. Yet, with the arrival of China's highway, the rules of the game began to shift. Geography, once the ultimate defense, was now vulnerable to the power of modern ambition. In Beijing, the project was never seen as just a road. Policy papers, military reviews, and quiet discussions in party offices all pointed to the same conclusion. Whoever could move swiftly across the roof of the world could tip the balance of Asia. The Trans-Himalayan Highway was designed to be more than an engineering marvel. It was a tool for leverage, a symbol of China's ability to overcome what had always been thought impossible. The world's highest peaks had always given India the strategic comfort of distance. With every meter of progress, that distance shrank. The unspoken message was clear: nowhere is truly out of reach. For Nepal, caught between giants, the road was both a blessing and a risk. The promise of trade, tourism, and independence from Indian control was tempting. For decades, nearly 80% of Nepal's imports came through Indian routes. Every political spat, every change in tariffs or border rules threatened Nepal's access to the world. The Trans-Himalayan Highway offered a new escape route, one that bypassed India and gave Nepal direct access to Chinese markets and ports. This was not a minor adjustment. It was a tectonic shift in how Nepal imagined its future. No longer just a buffer state, Nepal could now bargain with two superpowers, extracting aid, investment, and influence from both. The effects were immediate. Even before the highway was finished, Kathmandu began to sign new trade and transit agreements with Beijing. Chinese banks opened new branches, tech companies launched pilot projects, and construction firms arrived with plans for factories and special economic zones along the new corridor. Nepalese politicians, who once hesitated to defy New Delhi, grew bolder, knowing they had a new partner with deeper pockets and fewer conditions. The balance of power within Nepal itself began to change, with pro-China factions gaining strength in parliament and media. The shadow of the Himalayas grew longer, cast now not by the peaks, but by the deals signed in their valleys. For India, the news from the north was received with alarm. Decades of uneasy peace had always depended on the Himalayas serving as a natural buffer, slowing any advance and complicating logistics for both armies. Now, Chinese planners could boast that they had built a direct route not just for commerce, but for rapid military movement. It was not lost on Indian defense analysts that the new road paralleled the long-disputed border, known in India as the Line of Actual Control, where skirmishes had erupted as recently as 2020. The memory of Galwan Valley, where soldiers from both sides clashed with clubs and stones, remained fresh in every military briefing. India's response was swift, but dogged by years of bureaucratic delay and underinvestment. New Delhi ordered the acceleration of its own border infrastructure projects, launching new roads, tunnels, and airfields along the Himalayan frontier. Construction crews worked overtime in the thin air, racing to match China's pace. Yet, for every kilometre built, India seemed to fall two behind. Engineering challenges, environmental regulations, and political disputes slowed progress. Villages in the border regions watched as Chinese construction boomed just across the line, while Indian projects crept forward in fits and starts. The gap, once theoretical, became real, and for India's military planners, terrifying. The Trans-Himalayan Highway was more than a road. It was a wedge driven into the heart of Asia's most volatile rivalry. At stake was not just territory, but access, speed, and initiative in any future conflict. Logistics experts calculated how quickly Chinese forces could move supplies and equipment south. Analysts noted the number of tunnels wide enough for tanks, the way stations that doubled as military depots, the communications infrastructure embedded along the route. A road meant for prosperity could just as easily serve as a highway for war. Beyond the immediate threat to India, the highway's strategic value radiated outward. For China, it was a keystone in the Belt and Road Initiative, a sprawling network of railways, ports, pipelines, and highways connecting Asia, Africa, and Europe. Each new link reduced China's dependence on traditional sea routes, many controlled by the United States and its allies. The Himalayas, once a final barrier, were now a corridor for influence, allowing Beijing to reach deep into South Asia and project power far beyond its borders. For Washington, the implications were sobering. American military planners had long counted on the natural obstacles of Asia, the deserts, the jungles, and above all, the mountains, to slow any adversary's advance. Now, they watched as China demonstrated not just technical prowess, but a willingness to reshape the very terrain. The United States responded with diplomatic overtures to Nepal, promises of aid, and new training missions for the Nepalese military. Still, the underlying reality was hard to ignore. Roads change trade, but they also change security. With every day, Beijing's network of connections grew stronger, while traditional lines of defense weakened. The shift was not just military or political, it was economic. By opening a direct route through the Himalayas, China hoped to flood South Asia with its goods. Faster delivery, lower costs, and new markets would follow the road south. Nepal, once dependent on Indian products and pipelines, now had access to Chinese electronics, cars, and construction materials. For Bangladesh and Bhutan, the highway promised access to new trade routes, new customers, and a chance to break free from geographic isolation. But with opportunity came the risk of debt, dependency, and economic overreach. Chinese loans were famous for their generosity up front and their strict terms when payment came due. As the concrete dried and the final tunnels neared completion, every nation in the region faced a new reality. The Himalayas were no longer the world's last frontier. Instead, they had become the proving ground for a new kind of influence, one measured not just in kilometers of road, but in the speed of change and the reach of ambition. For centuries, power in Asia flowed around the mountains. Now, for the first time, it moved straight through. Yet beneath the deals and the drills, a deeper question lingered in the minds of diplomats, generals, and villagers alike. When the world's highest wall can be breached by concrete and willpower, what hope does anyone have of standing apart? As the chessboard shifted and new alliances formed in the shadow of the peaks, Asia found itself on the brink of a new era. What would it mean when the next crisis arrived, when the road that brought prosperity might also bring conflict? In a region where history is written in stone, was the future now being paved by China's hand? Roads of riches, rivers of risk. From a distance, the Trans-Himalayan Highway looks like progress in its purest form. Bridges soar over valleys, tunnels bore through ancient rock, and fleets of trucks snake along fresh pavement that gleams in the sun. But beneath the gloss of national achievement, the true test of the highway is lived out in the villages and towns that dot its path. For many in Tibet and Nepal, the arrival of the road has meant a collision of hope and uncertainty, prosperity and peril, all wrapped together in the unpredictable grip of change. For the communities along the route, the first promise was simple: opportunity. In regions where centuries-old isolation bred both resilience and poverty, the new highway was a revelation. Suddenly, young men who once dreamed only of herding yaks or leaving for distant cities found themselves working for construction crews, learning new skills, earning steady pay, and seeing machinery that looked like something out of science fiction. For women, markets grew busier as supplies arrived more quickly and reliably. Children who used to walk hours to the nearest school now hitched rides on supply trucks, laughing at the absurdity of passing through tunnels carved by machines as tall as their houses. Local shopkeepers prospered as workers flooded in. Restaurants sprang up, selling noodles and dumplings to exhausted crews. Entire towns swelled with new faces and new money. For the first time, electricity and running water became common in homes that once relied on candles and rain barrels. Clinics opened, schools expanded, and a sense of connection to the wider world grew stronger with every passing vehicle. The arrival of the highway was, for many, a chance to step into a new century all at once. Yet this rush of progress came at a steep price. The construction did not just bring jobs and investment, it brought strangers, stress, and upheaval. Prices for land and goods soared, pushing out families who could not keep up. Rents doubled in months. Entire neighborhoods changed hands, the old rhythms lost to a wave of outsiders seeking profit. Local customs struggled to survive the pressure of sudden growth. Festivals that once united communities were diluted, overtaken by the noise and distraction of constant traffic. Tensions flared between those who benefited from the boom and those left behind. The highway's influence extended far beyond the villages. In Kathmandu, the government scrambled to keep pace with the demands of integration. New trade agreements with Beijing shifted the balance of power, bringing in Chinese companies eager to build, invest, and supply.
China makes big promises. Massive and unsustainable projects are commissioned.
Nepal's leaders pointed to rising GDP, new jobs, and a sense of independence from India's often fickle embrace. For the first time, Nepal could dream of becoming more than a landlocked afterthought, a true player in the region, courted by two giants instead of squeezed between them. But with every new road and contract, the spectre of debt loomed larger. China's investment came at a cost, and history had already written cautionary tales in neighboring countries. Sri Lanka's massive port, now leased to China for nearly a century.
It was formally handed over to China last December on a 99-year lease, and is now operated by a joint venture between China and Sri Lanka.
was a warning that quick loans could lead to long-term dependency. Economists in Kathmandu worried quietly that the sums needed to maintain and repay the highway's loans would eventually outstrip the new revenue. As the repayments grew, so too did the risk that Nepal's sovereignty would be mortgaged for generations. For China, the calculus was more complex, but no less critical. The highway was not just a gift to Nepal or Tibet, it was an answer to China's own internal needs. Despite decades of state-driven development, Tibet remained one of the country's poorest regions. By threading a high-speed route through the mountains, Beijing hoped to boost trade, draw tourism, and foster industrial growth. New factories, markets, and logistics hubs followed the road south, bringing jobs and tax revenue. Chinese planners trumpeted the benefits to local Tibetans, highlighting efforts to train and employ ethnic minorities, fund rural schools, and open hospitals along the highway's length. Tourism, in particular, surged. Once inaccessible valleys filled with backpackers, mountaineers, and curious travelers eager to experience life on the world's roof. Hotels, restaurants, and adventure companies blossomed overnight. Towns that had rarely seen outsiders now welcomed visitors from Shanghai, Delhi, and even Europe. Their presence both a blessing and a burden. Cultural preservation projects sprang up, funded by both the Chinese government and international NGOs, hoping to balance economic growth with heritage. The world, it seemed, had discovered the Himalayas all over again. Yet prosperity's shadow grew long. The environmental costs became impossible to ignore. The Himalayas, known as the Third Pole for their massive ice reserves, are the water source for over 1 billion people. Their glaciers feed the Ganges, Yangtze, and Yellow rivers, lifelines for much of Asia. Highway construction destabilized slopes, triggered landslides, and sent debris cascading into rivers that were once clear and clean. Noise, dust, and pollution reached valleys that had known only silence for centuries. Endangered wildlife lost migration corridors, forced to adapt or vanish in the face of relentless progress. Climate change added urgency to these concerns. The region's glaciers were already melting at record rates, with new research showing that some would disappear within decades. Scientists warned that massive infrastructure projects like the Trans-Himalayan Highway could accelerate this loss, altering water flows and increasing the risk of catastrophic floods. In a world already struggling with drought and food insecurity, the prospect of water shortages loomed large. Environmentalists demanded greater transparency, access to construction zones, and independent studies, demands that were often met with silence or vague assurances from officials. Chinese authorities responded with a barrage of public relations campaigns. They highlighted state-of-the-art technologies, reforestation, slope stabilization, wildlife crossings, and new concrete mixes designed to reduce erosion. Reports boasted of teams dedicated to environmental monitoring, quick response units for landslides, and strict oversight of waste management. They claimed that better roads meant better access for conservation and research. Yet, on the ground, independent verification remained rare. Critics pointed to satellite images of clear-cut forests, polluted rivers, and scars of fresh landslides, demanding real answers in place of promises. Still, for every protest, there were stories of hope. A farmer in eastern Tibet who once traveled days to sell his barley now made the journey in hours, tripling his income. A young woman in Nepal, the first in her family to finish school, started a business delivering supplies to villages along the highway. Her dreams, once boxed in by mountains, now followed the open road. In each case, the line between progress and peril was thin, fragile, and shifting. As the years passed and the highway neared completion, the lessons became clear. Roads bring more than cars and commerce. They change the way people see the world, their neighbors, and themselves. Prosperity and risk walk hand in hand along new corridors. For the Himalayas, the price of connection is written not just in GDP or trade statistics, but in lost traditions, anxious families, and the uneasy silence that follows the rumble of the last departing truck. The Trans-Himalayan Highway stands as a monument to what humanity can build when ambition collides with geography. But for those who live in its shadow, the question remains whether the price of progress will one day outweigh its promise. Can economic dreams survive on a foundation as fragile as ice and memory, or will the road itself become another forgotten relic, lost to the shifting ground it was meant to conquer? The new Great Game. As the last section of the highway stretched toward completion, the region's leaders found themselves navigating a new and complicated reality. Diplomats, military planners, and business executives gathered behind closed doors in Kathmandu, Delhi, Beijing, and Washington, each trying to read the shifting landscape and anticipate the next move in a game where the stakes now reached far beyond borders. What had begun as a bold feat of engineering had become the axis on which new alliances and old anxieties turned. For Nepal, the new highway brought both hope and danger. With a direct link to China, the nation's traditional dependency on India was finally broken. Nepalese politicians pointed to trade figures that climbed every quarter, new factories being planned along the highway's route, and the sudden influx of tourists and investment. Young people who once saw their future only in migration now talked of starting businesses at home. Yet beneath this optimism lay an uneasy question. Would Nepal be able to maintain its sovereignty and independence, or would the weight of Chinese influence quietly tip the balance? Every new loan, every infrastructure deal, every trade agreement bound Kathmandu closer to Beijing. Some Nepalese leaders worried that in the rush for prosperity, they risked trading one form of dependency for another. India, meanwhile, was forced to reassess its own position. The Himalayas, once a source of comfort and security, had become a corridor for potential competition and confrontation. Indian intelligence tracked the progress of the road, analyzing satellite images and listening to reports from villagers in border regions. The government accelerated its own highway and tunnel projects, determined not to be left behind, but the sense of urgency could not erase the years of complacency. In the halls of government, analysts debated strategy. Should India try to match China's pace, court Nepal with more generous terms, or seek new partnerships with the United States and Japan to counterbalance Beijing's advance? Every option came with risk. The challenge was not just technical, but deeply political, a test of whether India could adapt to a world where geography was no longer destiny. In Beijing, the highway was celebrated as a triumph of Chinese resolve and vision. State media ran glowing documentaries about the workers who braved thin air and blizzards, engineers who invented new methods, and leaders who refused to accept the word impossible. But even as officials celebrated, they recognized the burden of stewardship. With great power came greater scrutiny. If anything went wrong, a collapse, a debt crisis, an environmental disaster, the blame would fall squarely on China's shoulders. The Trans-Himalayan Highway was now a symbol, and symbols are fragile things. The United States, watching from a distance, saw the project as both a warning and a challenge. American policymakers worried that China's ability to reshape physical geography would soon translate into political dominance, not only in South Asia, but across the developing world. Quiet diplomatic missions to Nepal and Bangladesh multiplied, offering support and alternative investment in hopes of keeping the region from falling entirely into Beijing's orbit.
So investment will create jobs, and jobs will uplift the economy, and knowledge and technology transfer will...
Yet, for all the money and attention, there was a growing sense that the old playbook, alliances forged at sea, influence wielded through markets and treaties, was less effective in an era where roads and railways decided the shape of power. Beyond the capitals and conference rooms, the people of the Himalayas lived out the daily reality of a world in motion. In small towns, families debated whether to send their children to new Chinese-backed schools or preserve old traditions. Farmers wondered if the streams running down from melting glaciers would last another generation. Elders who remembered a time before the first truck climbed these passes wondered if the mountains could ever truly belong to anyone again. Environmentalists continued to sound the alarm. Despite promises of reforestation and cutting-edge conservation, satellite images and local reports made clear that the scars left by bulldozers would not heal easily. Rivers silted up, rare wildlife vanished from familiar haunts, and the air sometimes tasted of diesel and worry. Scientists warned that the Himalayas, already vulnerable to climate change, might reach a tipping point. If the world's water tower faltered, the consequences could ripple far beyond Asia, affecting agriculture, migration, and even the security of distant countries. For all the rhetoric of unity and shared destiny, the region remained haunted by old mistrusts and the spectre of competition. No one could say for sure whether the Trans-Himalayan Highway would be remembered as the bridge that brought peace or the fuse that lit new conflict. Yet everyone understood that the old world was gone. In its place stood a road, solid, unstoppable, and leading into an uncertain future. As bulldozers laid the last stretches of pavement and engineers checked the final supports, the question repeated in every capital, classroom, and village. If China could build a road across the world's highest mountains, what else might it try? And if the rest of the world hesitated for even a moment, would it find the future had already been paved without its consent? History will remember this highway for more than its records and its reach. In concrete and ambition, it has redrawn boundaries, rewritten alliances, and forced an entire continent to rethink what is possible. The world's highest road is a symbol of humanity's drive to conquer obstacles, but also a reminder that every shortcut comes with a price. As nations scramble to keep up and neighbors learn to live with new realities, so who gets to shape tomorrow? The ones who build the roads, or the ones who travel them?